Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined, they're real. On September 6, 2024, Peoria police walked into a two-story house on West Ann Street and found a young woman lying at the base of the staircase, 20-year-old Mary Halcomb. Dead, gunshot wound to the neck. A .40 caliber handgun was resting loosely in her hand. There was no sign of forced entry, no broken glass. No neighbors reported hearing a scream. The boyfriend who called it in said she shot herself, and when dispatchers played back the recording, it sounded messy, not staged. But here's what raised a flag almost immediately. The body was at the foot of the stairs, but the blood trail started upstairs, and the scene was too orderly. The gun placement, the angle of the entry wound, a post-it note on the nightstand with a confession that read more like a script than a suicide letter. The uniformed officer on scene logged it simply, apparent self-inflicted gunshot wound. The detective who reviewed the body cam footage an hour later scribbled something else. Self-inflicted doesn't usually come with cleanup. This wasn't a city that saw murders often. In Peoria, Illinois, shootings weren't unusual, but staged suicides with a romantic undertone. That wasn't standard. This one didn't feel organic, and it didn't take long for the inconsistencies to pile up. The house wasn't in disarray, but it wasn't pristine either. The medical examiner noted trace amounts of gunshot residue on Mary's clothing, but not on her hands. There was no stippling around the entry wound, suggesting the shot wasn't fired at close range. That contradicted the story her boyfriend gave, where she supposedly put it to her neck and pulled the trigger while I was calling 911. Crime scene photos confirmed that the gun was placed near her right hand, though she was left-handed. Even small details like the angle of her wrist made investigators pause. It was limp, almost arranged, not the natural sprawl of someone collapsing under their own weight. The note on the nightstand said, "I, Mary Halcomb, promise to never break Nathaniel Archuleta's heart. If I do, he has every right to take me from this world." It was handwritten, possibly in Mary's penmanship, but the content didn't track. Investigators would later describe it as contractual, not emotional. By the end of that first day, no arrests were made. No charges were filed. The case was tagged for additional review pending autopsy and forensic confirmation. The working assumption? Suicide. But with 3 asterisks, Mary Halcomb had no prior mental health record. Her academic file showed high achievement, no disciplinary flags. Her text history, accessed via emergency warrant, showed no signs of a goodbye message, no suicide ideation, no dramatic change in tone or behavior. In fact, her last text was to a classmate. "Can't wait to see you this weekend. I need a break from all this." This, investigators would later discover, referred to a months-long pattern of controlling behavior in her relationship, jealousy, possessiveness, digital surveillance. But on day 1, that was all buried in data, and data doesn't speak until someone asks the right questions. What did speak immediately was the blood. The pattern of it on the hardwood floor upstairs, a partial drag smear extending from the bedroom doorway to the top of the stairs, contradicted the narrative. The lead detective reviewing initial evidence back at the precinct reportedly said, "Either she shot herself upstairs and crawled down 30 feet with a severed artery, or someone wants us to think that." Still, the body was transported. The boyfriend released, the firearm collected, and the post-it note sealed in an evidence envelope. The report filed that night ended with a single line, pending results from forensic pathology and ballistics. By the second day, investigators at the Peoria Police Department began reconstructing Mary Halcomb's life, objectively, methodically, and without speculation. This process wasn't about sympathy. It was about patterns. The questions were straightforward. Who was she? What had changed? And why would a 20-year-old with no mental health history allegedly write a suicide note that sounded like a legal document? Mary was a third-year undergraduate student enrolled at Illinois Central College. Academic records show a consistent GPA of 3.7, no disciplinary flags. Her schedule was tightly packed, core classes, 2 evening shifts at a local bookstore, and a pending internship with a campus social justice center. No record of missed deadlines or abrupt behavior changes. She had been living with her boyfriend for approximately 7 months. Lease documents confirmed both names, but most utility bills remained under Mary's. Bank records later showed she was the sole income earner covering rent and groceries. Text logs from her phone show she had recently reconnected with an old high school friend, male, casual tone, nothing romantic, but the volume of incoming messages spiked dramatically in the last 3 weeks of her life. The analysis team isolated 114 messages from Nathaniel Archuleta in the 5 days prior to her death. The tone varied from apologetic to accusatory, with timestamps between 2 a.m. and 4:30 a.m. Investigators flagged a pattern: sustained contact, late-night escalations, and short intervals between messages, a known profile of digital coercion. Still, the working theory hadn't shifted. On the surface, there was no smoking gun. Her recent Google search history painted a more detailed picture. 10 days before her death, Mary searched the phrase, "How to break up with someone who won't let you." Other entries included restraining order without police report and Illinois protective order boyfriend. She hadn't filed any formal complaint. There were no documented calls to law enforcement, no hospital visits, and no therapy appointments. But the digital trail was forming a new narrative, one where her autonomy was increasingly constrained. Interviews with her co-workers at the bookstore confirmed subtle red flags. One manager recalled Mary asking to switch her closing shift, citing home stress. A co-worker remembered seeing Mary standing outside during a break, arguing on the phone, voice low but urgent. No one heard what was said, but the manager noted that after the call, Mary asked if someone could walk her to her car. During an interview recorded on September 8th, her friend Shannon, who exchanged over 300 text messages with Mary that month, said plainly, "She told me she didn't feel safe, but she didn't want to make things worse by leaving fast. She said he watched everything." One important discovery came from Mary's email drafts folder. She had written, but not sent, a long message to her academic advisor explaining that she might need to defer classes due to personal circumstances. That message was dated 4 days before her death. The subject line read, "Help with late withdrawal." The message ended with a single line, "I'm just trying to get through this the safest way possible." There was also a second draft, written at 1:14 a.m. on September 5th, less than 24 hours before the reported suicide. It was addressed to her mother. Short, direct, "I love you. Don't worry about me. I'm going to figure this out soon." Investigators never recovered a final version. Technically, there were no violations, no formal crimes, but within the timeline there was evidence of mounting control. Mary's life didn't display the signs of someone preparing for suicide. It showed someone preparing to leave, and that was the difference. The lead detective summarized it in one internal case memo. No indication of pre-suicide behavior, indications of pre-separation behavior, victim likely preparing to exit relationship. The autopsy report was still pending, but the behavioral footprint, digital, social, academic, reflected someone in conflict, not someone in collapse. The Peoria County Coroner's report was delivered on the morning of September 11th, 2024. Until then, the case file had been largely theoretical, built on behavioral analysis, digital patterns, and inconsistencies at the scene. But nothing yet had confirmed what investigators suspected. Autopsy reports don't speculate. They measure, they document, they cut through narrative. Mary Halcomb died of a single gunshot wound to the neck. The bullet entered from the front left of her throat and exited at the back right near the base of her skull, creating a fatal pathway that severed both the carotid artery and upper cervical spine. Immediate incapacitation. The cause of death was listed as perforating gunshot wound to the cervical region. The manner of death remained pending investigation. Toxicology came back clean. No alcohol, no sedatives, no traces of anti-anxiety medication or narcotics. Her body was otherwise uninjured. No bruising, no defensive wounds. No restraint marks. That alone didn't prove or disprove anything, but it set a clinical frame. This wasn't a chaotic physical confrontation. The ballistics report added weight. The entry wound had no close contact stippling or soot deposition, meaning the shot wasn't fired at point-blank range. Gunshot residue, GSR, tests on her hands were negative. The only trace of residue was located on the front of her shirt and faintly on her lower jaw. Forensic conclusion: Mary was likely not holding the weapon when it discharged. The recovered firearm, a .40 caliber Smith & Wesson MP, was registered to a family member of her boyfriend, not to Mary. Investigators had initially accepted that the weapon was kept in the house for protection. But the placement of the weapon at the scene now mattered more than ever. The gun was found just beside her right hand, loosely positioned, as if dropped. The slide was locked back, indicating it had cycled properly. The shell casing was found on the floor 2 feet away. The angle of ejection aligned with a standing shot, someone holding the weapon at shoulder level and firing downward. That orientation was inconsistent with suicide. According to wound trajectory analysis, the shot came from a height of approximately 5.9 or 6:1 based on downward angle, and Mary stood 5'4". The report didn't accuse anyone, it didn't theorize, it just documented physical truths. But one statement in the conclusion caught attention. Given wound trajectory, firearm mechanics, residue distribution, and lack of close contact indicators, findings are not supportive of self-inflicted discharge. That was the phrase investigators had been waiting on. It didn't mean homicide, but it meant the narrative of suicide could no longer stand on its own. Detectives returned to the scene with fresh authority. A second, more targeted forensic sweep was conducted. This time, they used luminol in the upstairs hallway. It revealed a faint but definite drag pattern originating from the threshold of the bedroom. Blood was traced in a straight line toward the staircase. Swab samples matched Mary's DNA. This wasn't a blood pool caused by arterial spray. This was transfer, blood displaced by motion, not random, deliberate. Crime scene technicians also analyzed the pattern of vacuum lines in the bedroom carpet. Several lines appeared disrupted, suggesting something had been dragged across the floor post-mortem. These were the kinds of details that get missed when first responders operate under an assumption. Now, with the autopsy results shifting the frame, even vacuum lines became significant. At this point, detectives were instructed to re-interview the person who had called 911. This time, they approached it not as a witness statement, but as a timeline interrogation. Every minute mattered now. The original claim was that Mary had taken the weapon from the closet, walked down the hall, and, without warning, shot herself at the top of the stairs. But that version no longer aligned with blood transfer, GSR results, or bullet trajectory. Investigators asked, why would someone intending suicide walk 50 feet away from where the gun was stored before pulling the trigger? Why was the bullet's downward path so steep? Why was the shooter's hand clean? None of it held. And more importantly, it didn't need to. The forensic data had begun to overrule the narrative. In homicides that are staged to look like suicides, medical examiners often note a conflict between injury and narrative. That phrase became the guiding line in the working case file, and from this point forward, the tone of the investigation changed. Not officially, not in public statements, but internally, homicide protocol took priority. And behind closed doors, one of the senior investigators reportedly said, if she didn't pull that trigger, someone else did. And they had time to clean up, just not well enough. In homicide cases that first present as suicide, control is rarely visible at the crime scene. It's usually embedded in the timeline, buried in the daily patterns, the silent permissions, the digital footprints of a relationship that escalated before anyone outside could detect it. With the autopsy now ruling out self-infliction, investigators shifted focus. The forensic lab had already established that the physical evidence didn't support the narrative given by the sole witness. The next step was to determine whether the behavioral evidence, the pattern of control, aligned with a homicide by coercion and opportunity. Mary Halcomb's cell phone was unlocked via forensic software with a court-authorized warrant. The text log was expansive, but not chaotic. From June through early September 2024, nearly 3,000 messages were exchanged between her and her boyfriend. Detectives created a behavior map based on frequency, tone, and timestamps. The result wasn't subtle. She was contacted every day, no gaps longer than 5 hours, regardless of time. Many texts carried demands phrased as questions. Where are you? Why did you like that post? You didn't answer. Everything okay? When unanswered, the tone escalated. Short bursts of 3 to 6 messages spaced by seconds, not violent, not explicit, but consistent, demanding access. By late August, the language changed. She stopped initiating texts. Her replies grew shorter. Her search history overlapped with messages about safety, separation, and what counts as emotional abuse. Investigators noted a 36-minute window on September 3rd when she Googled restraining order process Peoria IL and simultaneously received 14 messages in that window, all from one person. That alone wouldn't hold up in court. But in investigations like this, it's rarely one message or one moment. It's how they connect to behavior. It's how intent hides inside repetition. Witness interviews added more context. Two of Mary's classmates reported that she had missed multiple back-to-back lectures in late August, unusual for her. When asked about it, she reportedly said, "I couldn't get a ride." Even though she had her own car, her employer at the bookstore confirmed a shift cancellation with short notice, citing unexpected situation at home. But the most compelling data point came from a digital audit of Mary's cloud storage. Her photos had been backing up automatically. Among them was a screenshot, time-stamped August 28th at 2:13 a.m. of a message that read, "You're not going anywhere. You think you have control. You don't." The message had been deleted from her device logs. It was not found in her messaging app. That indicated she likely took the screenshot knowing it might be removed or edited. For investigators, this wasn't just a precaution, it was evidence of pre-escalation awareness. She knew something had shifted. Control isn't always about isolation. Sometimes it's about omnipresence, being everywhere in someone's life until they stop acting without permission. Mary had stopped texting friends unless they reached out first. She missed group meetings, skipped gym sessions, and hadn't visited her parents in nearly 3 weeks. Her phone location data showed she had been home, regularly, during times she was previously away. Even her music app history shifted. Fewer public playlists, fewer active sessions. Investigators noted that she had turned off read receipts on her text messages shortly before September 5th. That was a small but significant behavior change. In victimology, it often reflects attempts to reclaim privacy, autonomy, without confrontation. With a clearer timeline in place, investigators began mapping her final 72 hours. On the morning of September 5th, Mary had received a phone call from a male classmate. It lasted 1 minute, 42 seconds. The call was flagged only because within the next hour she received 17 incoming texts, some apologetic, others interrogative. She didn't respond to any of them. This was less than 24 hours before her death. That same night, her phone connected to a Wi-Fi network from a separate guest profile, suggesting someone may have accessed her device without her primary credentials. System logs confirmed file deletions around 3:02 a.m., messages, photos, and voice memos. Technicians restored fragments of one audio file, corrupted but partially retrievable. The file was under 12 seconds. A single word was clear: stop. Investigators couldn't determine whether it was spoken in fear or defiance, but they knew it was recorded just 9 hours before her body was found. By September 13th, a formal case reclassification was underway. The department moved the file from undetermined death to suspicious homicide, domestic context. No suspects were named. No arrest was made. But internally, all resources were redirected toward one scenario: staged suicide following psychological coercion and lethal escalation. In small communities, stories like this don't just impact families. They disrupt patterns of silence. They surface questions that no one wanted to ask when the couple seemed normal. Because on the outside, everything looked fine, until it wasn't. On September 17, 2024, the case shifted again, but not from forensic testing or another scene revisit. This time, the information came from inside the Peoria County Jail. Not from a detective, not from a lab, from a fellow inmate. Nathaniel Archuleta had been held temporarily on an unrelated weapons charge, possession of a firearm without a valid FOID card. The arrest wasn't directly tied to Mary Halcomb's death, but investigators kept him close while building a larger case. No charges for homicide had been filed yet. There was still a gap between suspicion and prosecution. But while inside, Nathaniel talked. Not during official interviews, not to detectives, to another inmate, someone he shared a cell block with for just under 72 hours. That inmate, whose name remains sealed in court documents due to their cooperation agreement, contacted his public defender and requested to speak with authorities. What he told them was short, clear, and admissible. He said that Archuleta had claimed Mary was messing with someone else and that he lost it after reading a message on her phone. He said Archuleta described holding the gun, confronting her in the bedroom, and not meaning to actually do it. According to the inmate, Archuleta said, "It wasn't supposed to happen like that, but I couldn't let her leave, and I couldn't let it look like I did it." The inmate had no prior connection to Mary or the case. no motive to fabricate. He didn't ask for anything in exchange, no sentence reduction, no deal. He simply said he didn't want to hold on to something like that after hearing news reports about Mary's family asking for answers. The jailhouse confession was recorded in a signed affidavit and entered into the case file under seal. Investigators treated it as a secondary corroboration, not as a standalone breakthrough, but as a possible link to motive and method. Details from the inmate's statement also matched evidence never made public. Specifically, the inmate claimed that Archuleta described placing the gun in Mary's right hand after cleaning up the mess upstairs. That matched forensic analysis about blood transfer from the bedroom to the staircase. He also allegedly mentioned a note saying, "I had her write something before, just in case." This aligned with the strange post-it note investigators found near Mary's body, which forensics had already flagged as out of place. The statement didn't add new forensic evidence, but it aligned with what had already been established. When asked later why Archuleta would speak so freely, the inmate reportedly said, he thought no one believed her, and he thought nobody was listening. Legally, jailhouse statements require scrutiny. Courts treat them with caution, but when details line up with physical evidence, non-public, verifiable information, those statements hold weight. And in this case, they added something else investigators needed: timeline clarification. The confession established that the confrontation began in the bedroom, that Mary never left the room under her own power, that the shooting happened there and the body was later moved. That supported the blood drag marks, the wound trajectory, and the lack of GSR on her hands. It gave investigators not just a theory, but an internal voice to match external facts. By the end of that week, prosecutors filed an official motion to classify the death as a suspected domestic homicide. Charges hadn't yet been filed, but the path forward was now visible. And for investigators who'd spent weeks dealing with inconsistencies, it was the first moment where everything began to click: the scene, the behavior, the cover-up. In complex cases, it's rarely the confession alone that matters. It's when the confession fits. By late September 2024, the case file was no longer just suspicious. It was layered, cohesive, and prosecutable. The forensic contradictions, digital traces, behavioral records, and jailhouse admission had converged into a single, undeniable trajectory. It wasn't just that Mary Halcomb didn't take her own life. It was that someone had planned for people to believe she had. Behind closed doors, Peoria County prosecutors, investigators, and the coroner's office met to draft the formal probable cause affidavit. The focus was no longer on what happened, but on proving the how and why, without relying on a confession, without needing a moment of spontaneous guilt. This would be a case built the way domestic homicides often are, piece by piece, mistake by mistake. The arrest warrant was signed on October 3, 2024. Nathaniel Archuleta was charged with first-degree murder, unlawful use of a weapon by a felon, and obstruction of justice. The document outlined 10 forensic and circumstantial pillars, none of them dependent on a single witness or statement. The affidavit emphasized two primary factors: the impossibility of suicide based on ballistic and wound analysis, and the post-mortem staging that indicated intentional deception. What gave the case weight wasn't a dramatic confession. It was forensic clarity. Mary had no gunshot residue on her hands. The wound's trajectory was consistent with being shot from above. The blood transfer pattern confirmed her body had been moved. And the post-it note, written weeks earlier under questionable context, was not created in the moments leading up to her death. On the morning of October 4th, U.S. Marshals assisted local law enforcement in executing the arrest. Archuleta was located at a relative's house across town. He didn't resist. He didn't ask questions. He was taken into custody without incident and transported back to Peoria County Jail. The community response was quiet. In cases involving young victims, especially those tied to domestic violence, there is often a shift in tone once the initial shock fades. In this case, the silence wasn't detachment, it was recognition. People who knew Mary had suspected something wasn't right. They didn't have evidence. But now, the system did. In interviews with school staff, former co-workers, and even family members, a consistent theme emerged. People recalled seeing warning signs but felt powerless. That's not uncommon in coercive relationships. Control can happen in plain sight and still be invisible to those closest to the victim. But with the arrest, the narrative was no longer speculation. It was structured, backed by data, actionable. From a procedural standpoint, the case had reached its midpoint. Evidence would now be tested against defense motions. The note would be examined by handwriting experts. Digital timelines would be reviewed again by a third-party analyst. Prosecutors expected challenges, but they were prepared. The key to this kind of case isn't flash, it's consistency. The stronger the pattern, the less room for doubt. And in Mary's case, the pattern had been there all along. It just took a coordinated effort to connect it. In these investigations, there's always a shift, the moment when the system formally recognizes what the victim never got to say for themselves. The arrest wasn't the end of this story, but it was the beginning of accountability. And for Mary's family, it was the first step toward being able to grieve without being asked to justify her death. By November 2024, the public case against Nathaniel Archuleta had entered its next phase, pretrial review and evidentiary hearings. In Illinois, the burden at this stage isn't guilt beyond reasonable doubt. It's probable cause, supported by material fact. What prosecutors needed now was alignment, not speculation, not narrative, just connection between data and motive, between evidence and intention. The grand jury returned an indictment within 3 days. That wasn't unusual. The speed came from volume. More than 80 exhibits had already been presented. Digital communications, forensics, crime scene documentation, and sworn testimony. The defense, for its part, stayed mostly quiet. No statement from Archuleta. No public interview from counsel. Inside the courtroom, the strategy became clear. Challenge the process, not the facts. The defense filed 2 immediate motions. The first aimed to suppress the inmate's testimony, labeling it hearsay. The second challenged the forensic handwriting analysis of the Post-it note, arguing that emotional pressure wasn't legally provable as coercion. Neither motion succeeded. That Post-it, brief, handwritten, and allegedly predated by weeks, was now undergoing a layered handwriting comparison by a court-appointed examiner. The results didn't confirm forgery, but the evaluation returned an ambiguous phrase. Written under stress, consistent with dictation. In other words, possibly written by Mary, but not voluntarily, and not in the moment of her death. The motion to exclude that analysis was denied. The court ruled it admissible, provided it was not presented as definitive psychological evidence, but rather behavioral context. The difference mattered. Prosecutors weren't building a case on emotion. They were framing a method, a staged suicide, carefully controlled. At this point, the digital forensic audit had completed its second round. Investigators retrieved partial metadata from Mary's overwritten iCloud account. Among the findings, a deleted voice memo that was time-stamped just hours before her death. The audio was unrecoverable, but the metadata remained: name of file, date, size, and GPS tag. It had been recorded in the upstairs bedroom. That alone did not implicate anyone, but it placed Mary's device in the same location where forensic blood drag patterns originated. Another key discovery came from app analytics. Mary had installed a journaling app weeks prior, one with automatic sync and encrypted storage. While none of the entries were retrieved directly, usage logs indicated entries on August 22nd, August 30th, and again on September 5th, the day before she died. The final log showed the app was opened at 11:44 p.m. and closed just after midnight. That aligned with the approximate time prosecutors believed the confrontation began. The device was remotely wiped shortly afterward. The pattern was no longer linear, it was triangulated. Device movement, app usage, deleted files, and post-mortem staging were beginning to form a complete timeline. And crucially, none of it was speculative, it was data. Mary's family attended every hearing. They didn't speak, they didn't campaign. They sat silently behind the prosecution table, flanked by victim advocates. A quiet presence that underscored the purpose of every motion and exhibit presented. Cases like this often break along lines of narrative. Who seems more believable? Who tells a more coherent story? But this case wasn't built on perception. It was built on unchangeable physical evidence, recovered from a phone, a floorboard, a memory chip. The jury, when the time came, wouldn't be asked to guess what happened. They'd be asked to follow what had already been recorded. One unexpected motion from the defense aimed to question Mary's mental state in the weeks leading up to her death. The court denied it. There was no documented psychological diagnosis, no medication history, and digital records reflected active engagement with work, school, and future planning. The motion was labeled prejudicial and speculative. By December, trial was scheduled for mid-2025. The prosecution filed notice that it would pursue conviction under a domestic homicide theory. The charge remained first-degree murder, but the framing, coercion, emotional domination, and isolation was now explicitly part of the trial narrative. And even if no one heard Mary's voice in that courtroom, every digital trace she left behind was finally being read as what it was: evidence. On July 8, 2025, nearly 10 months after Mary Halcomb was found dead at the base of a staircase in Peoria, Illinois, the criminal proceedings entered their final stage. The courtroom was quiet as the prosecution prepared to present opening arguments. No cameras, no dramatic visuals, just rows of legal files, digital forensic reports, and a jury that had been carefully selected over the course of 2 days, the state of Illinois first. Nathaniel Archuleta began as a first-degree murder trial built almost entirely on traceable facts: forensic inconsistencies, digital behavior, metadata, handwriting analysis, and the absence of suicide markers. It did not depend on character assassination or emotional spectacle. The case strategy was clear. If you could prove method, you could prove motive. If you could map the control, you could show the intent. The prosecution began with the timeline: September 5th to September 6th, 2024. They walked the jury through Mary's last 24 hours. Her final app usage, the erased voice memo, the Google search timestamped at 11:46 p.m., how to safely leave a relationship that scares you. That search was recovered from device-level cache, not the browser. It had never been entered fully. It stopped mid-phrase. That mattered. They showed digital exhibits on screen: Mary's journaling app activity, the precise times her phone switched Wi-Fi networks, and the automatic backup logs that captured her screenshot of the note she was made to write. Then came the forensic breakdown of the scene: trajectory of the bullet, blood transfer from the bedroom, and the absence of stippling or GSR on her hands. Each data point was verified by state forensic analysts and then independently reviewed by a third-party expert. One key moment came when the court-appointed handwriting analyst testified. The Post-it note, the one found next to Mary's body, had already become symbolic, but the analysis kept it clinical. Under magnification, there were pressure breaks in the pen strokes, evidence of hesitation. The baseline slanted upward unnaturally. The analyst concluded, "The writing is consistent with someone writing under verbal pressure or dictation. It is not consistent with voluntary expression." The jury didn't react, but the impact registered. The defense kept its position minimal. It focused on chain of custody, the fallibility of metadata recovery, and the unreliability of jailhouse testimony. Their central claim was that the evidence pointed to a tragic, unpreventable suicide compounded by relationship stress. But by now, the jury had seen more than grief. They had seen sequence, pattern, execution, and erasure. One of the final witnesses was the digital forensic examiner who reviewed Mary's phone activity. He summarized the file deletion log in plain terms: audio files removed at 3:07 a.m., notes app scrubbed by 3:10 a.m., journaling app deleted at 3:13 a.m., entire device wiped at 3:18 a.m., all while Mary's body was allegedly already dead at the foot of the stairs. There was no need for dramatics. The timeline dismantled itself. Nathaniel Archuleta changed his plea before the jury could deliver a verdict. On July 9, 2025, he pleaded guilty to 1 count of first-degree murder in exchange for the state not pursuing life without parole. The plea was entered on record and sentencing was delivered immediately. The court sentenced him to 45 years in the Illinois Department of Corrections, with no possibility of parole under state guidelines. There were no outbursts, no protest, just the sound of a clerk confirming documentation and the slow shuffle of the defendant as he was escorted from the courtroom. During the victim impact statement, Mary's mother stood for the first time. She didn't cry. Her voice didn't waver. She read from a sheet of paper that had been folded and refolded dozens of times. She didn't describe Mary in soft terms. She described her daughter as methodical, bright, independent, but silenced. And she said one sentence that remained with every person in that courtroom: she was preparing to live. That's what makes this different. She didn't fade. She was planning, and he tried to erase that. The courtroom held its breath. In the weeks that followed, Mary's name became part of a wider conversation. Not trending hashtags or sensational media, but workshops, policy updates, Domestic violence task forces in Illinois began reviewing how coercive control presents in relationships where there is no bruising, no prior report, no visible threat, just a sequence of subtle erasures. Her family declined media appearances. Instead, they launched a small initiative through the college Mary had attended, offering free legal consults and tech safety training for students who felt watched or manipulated by partners. The name of the program was simple: Evidence Speaks. Because in this case, that's what turned the outcome. Mary couldn't testify, but her data did. Her screenshots, her app logs, her unsent emails, they built the case when her voice couldn't. Justice doesn't reverse time. It doesn't fix what happened. But in this case, it named it, legally, permanently. And sometimes that's the line that matters most. I didn't know Mary personally, but after going through every trace she left behind, I feel like I owe her this, a reminder that silence doesn't mean consent, and being careful isn't the same as being safe. If you're in a situation where you're constantly second-guessing yourself, your words, your freedom, it matters. Your instincts are not overreactions. Document everything. Tell someone. Exit quietly if you must, but never erase yourself for someone else's comfort. What do you think this case says about how we treat invisible abuse? Has our justice system caught up, or is this just one rare instance of it working? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read everyone. If this video hit home or made you think twice, tell me where you're watching from or what part stood out most, and if it didn't speak to you, tell me why. I want to learn from your view too. If you're new here and this story meant something to you, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next case.